As you know, low oil prices are bad in the first place for the governments of oil-producing countries that rely on exports of oil for a large part of their economic activity, a large part of their export revenues, and a large part of their state budgets. For oil-producing countries with relatively small populations and relatively high standards of living, it just means making some adjustments. But for oil-producing countries with large populations and low living standards, these prices can have a disastrous effect. Governments try to find ways of cutting state budgets. They often find themselves at the mercy of international financial institutions. National currencies are devalued. Economic activity is reduced. This is exactly what is happening in Russia now. Since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia has become even more economically dependent on revenues from commodity exports than the Soviet Union was towards the end of the Soviet period. Up until 2008, there was a boom in Russia, supported mainly by the high prices of oil and other commodities, in which average living standards increased year after year. The gap between rich and poor also widened, and some regions, some families, some sections of the population sank even deeper into poverty. But average incomes rose. This boom has now clearly come to an end. The sanctions imposed on Russia as a result of the Ukraine conflict are part of the cause. That's the part you read about in the newspapers. But a much more important cause is the fall of the price of oil, which has triggered a devaluation of the ruble. The ruble lost 46% of its value against the dollar in 2014. It's part of the unjust way that the world economy works that millions of people, who of course have no control at all over the price of oil, will suffer material hardship because of these low prices, not only in Russia, but for example in Nigeria and other African oil-producing countries and in Latin America. There has been a fair amount of commentary about whether low oil prices will help or hinder the transition away from fossil fuels. Some environmentalists have been pleased that some of the extreme oil, such as the Arctic projects, is likely to be put on hold because of costs. But I think this should not be regarded as so obviously positive. For one thing, every project put on hold due to low prices now can be brought on again when prices rise. But another important issue is that, given the way that energy markets work, government plans to promote renewable technologies such as solar, wind power, heat pumps and so on will probably be cut back. Gas prices are also low at the moment. If electricity can be produced cheaply from gas, why invest in wind or solar? If the price of types of oil used in transport goes down, why invest in electric cars? The experience of the last prolonged period of low oil prices in the 1980s is not positive. In the mid-1970s, sharp increases in oil prices produced the so-called oil shock. This shock, as you know, is essentially a rich country construct. In many developing countries at that time, there was a real crisis. Millions of people had little or no electricity and other basic energy supplies, and the price increase put oil products out of the reach of millions more, and it aggravated consumer price inflation. But the shock that we generally read about was in the richer countries. They suddenly found that one of the chief sources, oil, had risen sharply in price, and that their economies suffered. In any case, the oil shock did change energy policies in rich countries. Firstly, governments started to think about energy efficiency seriously for the first time. The USA even imposed fuel efficiency standards on car manufacturers. Secondly, governments encouraged some investment in renewable energy sources that previously they had ignored. Solar benefited in the USA and elsewhere. So did heat pumps, for example, in Sweden and Switzerland. But in the 1980s, much of the progress made by renewable energy and by energy efficiency ground to a halt. Obviously it's complicated, and obviously different things were happening in different places, but in the USA there was a marked a marked switch away again from renewables and from energy efficiency. Oil prices fell again, and that coincided with the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who dismantled federal regulation agencies that upheld environmental standards. Much of what had been done was undone. Fuel efficiency standards for cars, which had been going up, stopped going up. Investment in solar and other renewable technologies dried up. It almost seemed as though the US political leadership wanted deliberately to burn more fossil fuels and to emit more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.